It's a story with the headline so shocking and sad, you have to read it twice to believe what police are alleging. This 7-year-old boy is dead. He allegedly weighed 255 pounds. Now his parents are charged with murder after the boy was found unresponsive in their
The call comes in just before 9 in the morning.
Around 8:30, but then 15 minutes later, she went to check on him and he was no longer breathing, so she called 911. One of the first officers who entered the home writes, quote, "I observed extreme hoarding conditions. There was trash on the floor throughout the residence. It was so extreme, I could not tell if there was carpet or..."
A 7-year-old boy, not breathing. Dispatch relays it flat, almost mechanical, the way these calls always sound before anyone knows what's waiting behind the front door. Cross a die in Corona for a 7-year-old male, 7 not breathing. Sounds like they're getting CPR started. An engine is already rolling from downtown. Court, and nobody on that radio knows yet what they're about to walk into. Officers arrive at a house in Flint Township, Michigan. A mother meets them, or maybe she's already inside, already frantic, already talking. Her son had been breathing at 8:30, she says. 15 minutes later, when she checked on him again, he wasn't. So she called 911. That's the story as it starts. A tragedy. A sudden unexplainable collapse. The kind of thing that happens to families every day. The kind of grief nobody can prepare for. Except the moment police step through that front door, the story stops being simple. One officer writes that he can't tell if the floor beneath him is carpet or wood.
They really had a hard time finding the words to describe what they experienced when they went into this house. There's one officer who writes, quote, "The residence was absolutely disgusting and can't be accurately described in words." Another officer said, "Upon entering through the front door, I observed the living room completely covered in trash, including numerous stacked garbage bags." Then in the summary of one statement by an officer, they write, quote, "The residence was overwhelmingly cluttered and unsanitary with large amounts of trash and poop throughout, which emitted an overbearing and foul odor. Furthermore, there were abundant insects throughout the entirety of the residence." This home was a mess.
Not because the lighting is bad, because the trash is that deep. Another writes that the smell hits before the sight does, and the sight, when it comes, is somehow worse. Stacked garbage bags in the living room, insects moving through every room in the house.
And that is putting it lightly. And inside, as they work their way through the trash, police say, they encounter Casper O'Brien, this young boy who was unresponsive. They were allegedly doing CPR on him, Casper's family members, specifically his uncle. But police end up rushing Casper to the hospital, and he is pronounced dead before noon on that day. And according to the local medical examiner, Casper's cause of death was dilated cardiomyopathy.
An odor one officer calls overbearing, and another simply refuses to describe it all, writing only that the home cannot be accurately described in words. Stay with me here. Because in the middle of all that, in a house that 5 separate officers struggled to put into a police report, they find a 7-year-old boy. Unresponsive, courting his uncle is already trying CPR. Paramedics rush him out, rush him to the hospital, and before noon that same day, Casper O'Brien is pronounced dead.
With a copay of just $20. Now, when asked why she did not take her nonverbal autistic son to a doctor, police say inconvenience was the reason. She didn't like the fact that she would have to go and wait in a waiting room for a long time, then see a doctor, and then after 5 minutes, the doctor would say her son was okay. She also told police that she had a distrust of doctors because she claimed she was sexually assaulted by a doctor.
He weighed 255 pounds. Let that sit for a second. Not spiral into it, just sit with it. 255 pounds is a number people use to describe grown men. Linebackers is not, under any circumstance that makes sense to the human brain, a number that belongs to a 4'2", 7-year-old boy. Courting, and that's where this case begins to split into 2 different stories running side by side. One is about how Casper died. The other is about how anyone let it get this far. By the time the medical examiner rules on cause of death, weeks after Casper's obituary is written and quietly published, calling him a bright, joyful boy whose spirit touched everyone around him, the story his parents are telling police no longer matches the one his body is telling investigators. And that gap between what Jessica and Damien O'Brien say happened and what the evidence shows happened is what turns a devastating loss into a murder case. Courting. Before we get into what police found on Casper's body, and I promise you it's difficult, we need to understand who he was and who was supposed to be protecting him. Casper O'Brien was born into a family that, from the outside, looked ordinary enough. 2 parents, a younger sister, a house in a quiet township outside Flint. Casper was diagnosed with autism early in his life, and his family has said he was nonverbal. He couldn't tell anyone when something hurt. He couldn't ask for help. He couldn't explain what he wanted, or what he needed, or what was happening to his own body. Everything about his care depended entirely, completely, on the adults around him. Recording, that's worth sitting with for a moment quietly, because it's the thing this whole case turns on. A non-verbal child can't advocate for himself. He can't call a friend and say something feels wrong. He can't walk into a school nurse's office. His entire world was the people who fed him, bathed him, and decided whether or not he saw a doctor. According to what Jessica O'Brien later told police, Casper spent about 12 hours a day in his bed. He was mobile, she said, but bedridden for half of every day regardless. His diet, according to his mother's own statements, consisted of a large bag of potato chips daily, a large order of French fries, sugary carbonated soda, and apple juice. Recording. She told investigators Casper simply wanted to eat constantly, something she attributed to an undiagnosed eating disorder. Here's the thing though. Investigators and frankly anyone with basic math will tell you that diet alone doesn't explain a 255-pound 7-year-old chips and soda and fries, as unhealthy as that sounds. Recording doesn't typically produce that kind of extreme rapid weight gain on its own. Something else has to be happening. And that's a question this case still hasn't fully answered. Not publicly. Not yet. What we do know is that Casper hadn't seen a doctor in roughly 2 years. Not a routine checkup, not a specialist, nothing. And police say his mother never made real efforts to change that, despite having the ability to. Now here's where everything starts to shift, because Jessica O'Brien didn't tell police that doctors were unavailable to her. She didn't say money was the problem. She told investigators that she and her husband saw doctors themselves regularly. Her most recent appointment, she said, was the month before Casper died. Her husband Damien worked in IT, a job that came with solid health insurance and a co-pay of just $20. $20. That's the bearer that supposedly kept a non-verbal, morbidly obese 7-year-old from medical care for 2 straight years. According. When police asked her directly why Casper hadn't seen a doctor, she gave them a reason that, honestly, still stops me every time I read it.
Noticed in the narrative that's been laid out by police, and it's that Jessica O'Brien told them that one of the family dogs had a stroke the night before Casper died, and she got up that morning to make a vet appointment. Think about that. Her dog allegedly has a health issue. So the first thing she does, call the doctor for that dog. And yet her son hadn't seen a doctor in roughly 2 years. Police say she didn't even know who Casper's pediatrician was. This was a boy who had serious
Inconvenience. She didn't like sitting in waiting rooms. She didn't like that after all that waiting. A doctor would spend 5 minutes with Casper and tell her he was fine. She also told police she distrusted doctors because of a past sexual assault she says she experienced at the hands of one. And look, recording, I'm not here to question whether that happened to her. I have no way of knowing, and neither do you. And it's not something to wave away. But even taking that at face value, it doesn't explain the rest. Because she herself went to the doctor the month before Casper died. The distrust, whatever its root, apparently didn't apply to her own care. According Justice. This next detail almost nobody talks about when this case comes up online, and it's the one that for me changes the entire emotional register of this story. The night before Casper died, one of the family's dogs had a stroke.
Him at their home. As far as Jessica, she did speak to investigators. Police say in an interrogation they showed her pictures of Casper's body, and Jessica allegedly claimed that the sores on Casper's backside were only there for a month. They note that originally she claimed that they were only there for a couple of days. She then said that she had no idea that Casper had rashes on his body.
That's what Jessica told police, and her first move the next morning, before anything else, was to plan on calling the veterinarian to get that dog seen. Sit with that. A dog has a medical emergency, and the plan is immediate, clear, obvious. Call the vet. But a 7-year-old boy, her own son, hadn't been inside a doctor's office in 2 years. Despite weighing 5 times what a child his age should weigh, she reportedly didn't even know who Casper's pediatrician was. I've covered a lot of cases. I try not to let details get to me the way they used to. But that one, the dog and the doctor, that one stayed with me longer than I expected it to. So now we have the outline of neglect. Here, a child kept from medical care, a child confined to a bed for half of every day, a child fed a diet that, by itself, doesn't add up to his condition. But neglect, as devastating as it is often treated differently under the law than something intentional. And this is where police say the story stopped being about carelessness, courting, and started looking like something else entirely. Because what officers found when they examined Casper's body at the hospital wasn't consistent with a boy who'd simply been overworked and under-monitored. It was consistent with prolonged, severe physical suffering. I want to warn you, this next part is hard to hear. According to the police report, recording the bag Casper's body was placed in carried a smell that wasn't decomposition. It was something else. Investigators described it as poor hygiene, filth, and possible infection. Casper appeared not to have been bathed in a very long time. Dirt and dead skin had built up across his body. His hair, long and matted, had begun to dreadlock in places, or a sign it hadn't been brushed in months. His fingernails were long, filthy, unkempt. When officers examined his skin folds and his armpits, they documented reds and open sores, some of them showing signs of active infection, swelling built up around them. One investigator, someone who has presumably seen difficult things before in this line of work, wrote that these were some of the worst open sores and rashes he had personally ever witnessed. Casper was wearing a disposable brief. It was soiled with dried feces and urine. When officers removed it, they found deep red rashes and open sores across the backside of his legs, his thighs, his buttocks, infected, swollen. These aren't injuries that appear overnight. A rash like that, sores like that, they build over weeks, sometimes months. They're the kind of thing that happens when a body is left in the same position, in the same soiled clothing, without care for an extended stretch of time. And that's the detail that turns this from a story about a chaotic, neglectful household into something prosecutors are now calling torture. Let's go back to the house itself for a second, courting, because the environment Casper was living in matters just as much as what was happening to his body. Officers described extreme hoarding conditions. Garbage covering the floor throughout the residence, so thick in places that they genuinely couldn't tell what kind of flooring was underneath it. Stacked bags of trash in the living room. An overpowering smell that multiple officers, independently, in separate written statements, struggled to put into words. Insects throughout the home. This wasn't a one-time mess, not a bad week, not a rough month. A retired homicide detective who spoke about this case put it simply: the house doesn't get to that condition in 7 years. Courting, it takes longer than that, which means, in all likelihood, both of these children, Casper and his younger sister, were born directly into this environment. They never knew anything different. Casper's 5-year-old sister was also found inside the home. Police say her fingernails were dirty, her hair knotted and tangled. Recording, and she had a persistent cough that raised concern given everything else in the air inside that house. She's since been removed from the home. One of the neglect charges against her parents relates directly to her condition, which police describe as severely overweight and unclean as well. Now here's where the timeline gets interesting, because it tells you something about how this case built itself, piece by piece, over the better part of a year. Casper died on November 4th, 2025. His obituary was published shortly after, describing him the way families describe children they've lost, warmly, lovingly, without any hint yet of what investigators were beginning to uncover. Courting for months, the investigation continued quietly. Medical examiners worked through Casper's cause of death. Detectives built out witness statements, evidence, timelines, and then on June 23rd, nearly 8 months later, Jessica and Damien O'Brien were arrested. Damien didn't speak to investigators. He asked for a lawyer the moment police arrived to take him into custody. Jessica did talk, and what she told them across that interrogation is where the real cracks start to show. Police showed her photographs of Casper's body.
Jessica saying that she was unaware of the health issues that her son was having. Quote, I then asked Jessica, did you ever think of how much pain Casper was in? Jessica replied, quote, no, and I probably should have. I then asked Jessica, why do you say that? Jessica replied, just seeing this now, I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know it was that bad. I was so in my depression that it just. I then summarized that Casper hadn't received a bath or shower.
Courting, when they asked about the sores on his backside, she initially said they'd only been there a couple days. Then, later in that same interrogation, she revised that. A month, she said, not days. A month. Now, medical examiners can generally tell the difference between a sore that's a few days old and one that's had weeks to develop, infect, and worsen. So that shift in her story from days to a month isn't a small inconsistency. It's the kind of detail that starts eating away at credibility in exactly the way prosecutors need it to. She told police she and Damien would clean Casper with wipes roughly 3 times a week because he didn't like water and didn't like being bathed. Courting. But then, in the same conversation, she said it wasn't as much wiping as she would have liked, which is its own kind of admission buried inside an excuse. At one point, an investigator asked her directly,
Damien ever discussed their concerns for Casper's medical state and the condition that he was in? Jessica stated, quote, no, we were falling apart at that point. His drinking had gotten really, really bad, and we weren't really communicating, and I was basically taking care of the kids on my own. She alleges that Damien.
Recording. Did you ever think about how much pain Casper was in? Her answer? No, and I probably should have. When pressed on why she was saying that now, she told them, just seeing this now, I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know it was that bad. I was so in my depression that it just... She didn't finish that sentence in the report. Courting, maybe she couldn't. Jessica went on to describe a household that was, in her words, falling apart.
Michigan prosecutors don't see what happened to Casper, though, as just an act of child abuse or neglect, even though allegedly it certainly is that. They are calling this murder. Jessica and Damien are charged with second-degree murder, torture, and 3 counts of second-degree child abuse. One of the child abuse charges, by the way, is related to the health and safety of Casper's 5-year-old sister. We told you already that police had concerns about her, and they say she was, quote, morbidly overweight.
According, she said Damien's drinking had gotten significantly worse, that the two of them weren't really communicating anymore, and that she was effectively raising both children on her own. She described financial stability, no shortage of money, both of them managing their own health conditions, including diabetes, with prescription medication. And their own care was, by her account, being handled. Casper's wasn't. He also never attended school. His parents told investigators they'd wanted to enroll him in a program for children on the autism spectrum, but it's unclear whether they ever took real steps to make that happen. And that detail matters more than it might seem to on the surface. Recording. Because school is often where neglect gets caught. Teachers notice things, nurses notice things. Mandated reporters exist specifically to catch kids who are falling through the cracks at home. Casper never had access to any of them. He was essentially invisible to anyone outside that house, which raises the quiet, courting, uncomfortable question this case keeps circling back to. How does something like this go unnoticed for so long? Where were the extended family members? The neighbors? Anyone? I don't have a clean answer for you. I wish I did. So where does all of this leave the legal case? Michigan prosecutors aren't treating this as simple neglect, even though, and by any definition, neglect is clearly part of what happened here.
Here's what comes to mind to me: wanton and willful. The behavior on those parents is wanton and willful. You don't put a kid in school. They said he was nonverbal and autistic, never had him diagnosed. The other child is also morbidly obese and wandering around unclothed. This is intentional behavior by these parents.
Jessica and Damien O'Brien are facing second-degree murder charges, a torture charge, and 3 counts of second-degree child abuse, one of which relates specifically to their surviving daughter's condition. That's an important legal distinction, and it's worth slowing down for. Neglect charges, according to the retired detective who spoke about this case, are often the easier ones to prove. You look at the state of the home, you look at the condition of the surviving child, that evidence largely speaks for itself. But second-degree murder, that requires something more. It requires showing intent, or at minimum, a level of willful disregard that goes beyond simply failing to notice a problem. And that's exactly the language investigators used: wanting and willful.
Torture. Torture was on one of the charges. Now, torture, what could that be? Could that be force feeding this kid? I think it could be.
Not accidental, not the result of ignorance. A pattern of choices, repeated, sustained, made by 2 adults who had the resources and the ability to get their son help and consistently chose not to. The torture charge is the one that raises the most unsettling question of this entire case, and it's one that hasn't been fully answered publicly.
Particular weight. Like, it just seems like there has to be more there.
You would have to have a constant drip of carbonated sugar soda, almost like an IV, to put that many calories in your body to gain that kind of weight. It's got to be. It's got to be force. It's almost like force feeding. I can't imagine anything else.
Officials examining this case have pointed out that a diet of chips, fries, and soda, as damaging as it is, doesn't typically explain that level of extreme rapid weight gain in a 7-year-old on its own, which leaves open the very difficult possibility that something more deliberate was happening.
Second, Casper was 4'2" at the time of his death, which makes his body mass index 71.7. And according to the CDC, a 7-year-old's BMI should be 16. Join us now to talk more about this case is retired Detective Commander Will Sevilla.
In something closer to force feeding. Nobody has confirmed that publicly. It hasn't been proven in court. But it's the kind of question that sits at the center of a torture charge, and it's the kind of question a jury will eventually have to weigh. Casper's body mass index at the time of his death was 71.7. For context, the CDC considers a healthy BMI for the old to sit around 16.
So I looked that up. I'm obviously not a doctor, but the National Institutes of Health says that it is heart disease, and it's associated with people who struggle with obesity. And to my understanding, your heart enlarges and it's almost stretched too thin to be able to pump blood effectively. Casper's heart, it was just too weak to continue work.
That's not a slightly elevated number. That's a number that, medically speaking, is almost impossible to reach through diet alone, especially not in the time frame suggested by photos of Casper from just 2 or 3 years earlier, where he appears to be a bigger kid, sure, but nowhere close to the boy described in that police report. Something changed, and changed fast in the final stretch of Casper's life. What exactly caused that shift is still, in a lot of ways, the unanswered center of this entire case. The cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was dilated cardiomyopathy, a form of heart disease strongly associated with severe obesity.
32 years on the police department working murders, most of those 32 years. I've seen a lot of things. I never saw anything like that. I mean, I've seen neglect cases, I've seen abuse and baby murders, but I have never seen anything like this.
When it comes to some of these hoarding cases,
Quoted in simple terms, Casper's heart had enlarged and stretched to the point where it could no longer pump blood effectively. It just gave out. A 7-year-old's heart failing the way an elderly patient's might after decades of strain. I keep coming back to that image. Not the sores, not the trash, not even the weight itself, according, but the idea of a small heart working as hard as it possibly could, for as long as it possibly could, inside a body that had been pushed far beyond anything it was built to carry. He was 7 years old. The attorneys representing Jessica and Damien O'Brien are due in court, with proceedings tied to this case moving forward from there. Courting. Whatever comes out in that courtroom, whatever gets argued about intent, about torture, about who knew what and when, none of it changes the fact that a 7-year-old boy who couldn't speak for himself, who depended entirely on the adults around him, spent what appears to have been the final stretch of his life in pain that, according by every account from the people who found him, was severe, visible, and ongoing. There's a detective who worked this case, 32 years in homicide, who said something that's hard to shake.
At least I thought, and I'm not an expert on it by any means, but like how that would even be possible. So like we'll see what happens next in this story. This boy deserves.
In 3 decades of working murders, neglect cases, abuse cases, even infant homicides, he said he'd never seen anything quite like this one. Not the scale of it, not the specific layered cruelty of a child left in that condition, while a family dog received faster, more attentive medical care. That comparison isn't an exaggeration for effect. Recording, it's in the police report. The dog had a stroke, and the plan, immediate and clear, was to call a vet. Casper hadn't seen a doctor in 2 years, and the excuse given was inconvenience. I don't think there's a clean way to end a story like this one. Casper O'Brien isn't a statistic, courting, and he deserves better than to be remembered only for the number on a medical chart or the horror of a police report. According, somewhere in that obituary, written before any of this came out publicly, his family described him as bright, as loving, as a boy whose spirit touched the people around him. I hope that part was true. I hope, somewhere in that house, in whatever moments he had, he felt something close to that. What happened to him afterward? Courting. What allegedly happened in that home for months, maybe years, is now something a jury will have to sit with, weigh, and ultimately decide. Was this willful cruelty? Was it torture in the legal sense? Was it neglect that spiraled so far out of control that intent almost stops mattering? Court, I don't think any of us watching from the outside can fully answer that. But I'll leave you with the same question that detectives circled back to more than once. How does a house get to that condition, unnoticed, for years, with 2 children inside it the entire time? Who else could have seen something and didn't? Courting. And what does it say about the systems meant to catch kids like Casper, that a boy this sick, this size, this clearly suffering, could go 2 full years without a single doctor laying eyes on him? That's the part of this case I don't think anyone has fully answered yet. And it's the part I think about longest after everything else about this story fades.